Howdy, pards. Welcome back. I'm back again real quick. Got some questions about my previous video on the differences between Aristotelian political theory, let us say, on the idea that human beings are by nature political animals, as Aristotle puts it. Which is right here. Internet Archives of Benjamin Jowett translation of the Politics, since it is evident that the state, it should actually be the city, the polis is the word used in Greek, is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal. And the modern contract theory based on Hobbesian ideas, I use Richelieu as the guy who is credited with kind of forcing the idea of the state that comes to be understood in Western civilization after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That's really Hobbes who codifies the contractarian notion of political organization. Which one is right? Somebody asked me, okay, which one's correct? Aristotle's closer to being correct in my estimation than is Hobbes. Here's what goes with that. Given that we have now been over 300 years in the contractarian understanding of political organization, it has become for us, I was talking about for Americans especially, but for residents of Western civilization, it has become tradition, and therefore we are born into it as covered on Aristotle's understanding. And so that's what has come to be accepted as legitimate, as the only real legitimate form of political organization, which is based in some way on a kind of consent, you might say, which is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. It's not mentioned in the Constitution of the United States, by the way. So given the fact that I think anthropologically speaking, as a matter of human nature, Aristotle's closer to being right than is Hobbes, I would say the proper way to understand this is by really combining the two, which Hegel does to some extent, by the way. And you get a lot of nut jobs out there that, Hegel leads to Marx. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. But I'm not going to get into that. But the reality is that yes, you are born. You're not born as a self-sufficient entity. You are born literally. I was getting back. There are real biological limitations. You are born as a human being. Any animal is, for that matter, but the period of dependency for a human being is much longer. You are born to a woman who, in Western civilization, at least traditionally, up until fairly recently, usually had a mate in the house known as a husband. And you, as the infant that is being born, literally require the care of those people for years and years. And that's what makes human beings distinctively, their political nature distinctively different, combined with speech, the power to speak, than that of other animals. As Aristotle talks about, ants and bees are social animals too, by nature. They don't have political organization because they like speech. But, you require literally the care of your parents until at least adolescence. That's in a more traditional society, it would be until adolescence. In complex, post-industrial Western societies, the reality is it's longer than that. Very few individuals anymore are capable of taking care of themselves prior to their 20s in some point. Some of them even longer than that. Even if they're not living with their mother and father, they're being cared for by the state in some form or fashion. They seem to like that, by the way. They don't want to take responsibility for themselves. But in any event, so in that respect, I would say Aristotle is absolutely correct, anthropologically speaking, that you're born into a family. Your family is part of a community that also is in need of others. And so, no, you're not some little logical social atom out there bouncing around with a bunch of rights that it's the job of the community to protect. No, it's your duty to go along with the community. However, our community, and by our I mean the United States of America, which is part of the wider version of Western civilization, our community has a notion of individual rights based on Hobbesian contract theory, and so that's our tradition now. And so we're not getting away from that anytime soon, even if there is some type of revolutionary insurrection that occurs somewhere in Western civilization. You're not going to have a complete break with rights politics as understood by the social contract theory of organization, defined initially by Hobbes and picked up later, certainly, Locke, certainly part of the United States understanding of political organization, and everywhere in Western civilization, as I've said. And given the dominance of Western civilization from that period of time, let's say from the 16th through the 20th centuries, it's infected all parts of the world to some extent. But again, you can't claim, for example, that the nations outside of Western civilization have an understanding that is commensurate with what we would think of as rights politics. So I would say Aristotle is essentially correct in that yes, you're born into a situation that determines your political allegiance to some extent, and without some very, very strong claim to the contrary, there's no necessarily right to revolution. Even the Declaration of Independence I mentioned before, it states, you shouldn't use light and transient reasons. That you should bear inconveniences as long as they can be bared. Because the alternative is when you start talking about insurrection and revolution, the potential for disaster is very high. That's what concerns me, that the left doesn't seem to understand that this notion they have that change is inherently good. The potential for disaster is extremely high. So what do you do? You don't do a whole lot of anything, really. I mean, you watch the situation and see what's going on. Someone who thinks about these matters can't help but be, how shall I put it, dismayed by the direction of things. And this predates Trump by a long time, by the way. I mean, this stuff, no, Trump is a manifestation of this. He's not a cause of it. He's a consequence of this decline that set in a long time ago. So that trying to use him as the reason or justification for strange behavior is just nonsensical. However strange that someone may think his behavior itself is. The fact that he was able to be elected, behaving as he did, indicates where the citizenry is. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. So that's why I mentioned in the previous video that the requisite endowments are not present right now. They're not. You're not likely to get someone who could come along and rectify the situation. Let's use Reagan as an example. Those who are, by nature somewhat conservative would tend to look upon Reagan as favorably. Reagan could do little more than forestall what was already coming, which I would say he probably did to a pretty large degree. He was able to forestall it for about a generation, and then by the time we got to the end of the second Bush 43 administration, they used a crisis again, in this case, financial crisis, to lurch left. Got another crisis now. It's not a coincidence that this thing came up in an election year here. And so they're going to try to use the crisis to lurch left even more. It's difficult for me to see it not happening in some form or fashion. By the way, Trump goes along with this stuff. He's very much in favor of government takeovers of things. He just doesn't call it that. Government, for example, I mentioned the COVID bill that was passed, by Congress last spring when the pandemic hit. He was all in favor of that. The debt had already been skyrocketing under Trump. He's all in favor of that. So it's difficult. I don't think of him as conservative. Certainly not economically. The fact that he has presided over the appointment of judges that are thought to be somewhat conservative. Okay, yeah, that's true, but that doesn't make him a conservative president by any means. So, Aristotle is the true conservative in that sense, which is contrary to contract theory of political organization, which is liberalism. It's based on individual liberty. What is now called a liberal in the United States is not really a liberal. It's not someone who likes liberty. It's someone who wants the government to take over everything. So they are the opposite of liberals. That's what we have gotten so warped in our political discourse that up is down and down is up. Liberals are not liberals, and conservatives are not conservatives. And you try to explain this to people, and you get a dumb look on it. But they keep calling them liberals. I don't care what they call them. It doesn't make it true. What does the word mean? It means they're a liberal. Okay, what does it literally mean? The base of the word liberty. Are the people who are referred to as liberals in the United States, are they in favor of unfettered liberty? And the answer is obviously no. They're in favor of the federal government taking over things. They're progressives in that sense. Statists. They want the state, in the form of the federal government in the United States, to control things and to redistribute things. Obviously, they want it done as they want. That's their individual aspect. But they're not liberals in any sense. The liberals are those who would be actually what are now called conservatives, who want individual liberty. But again, things have gotten so messed up. That's part of the reason why it's hard to see anything coming out of this that could possibly result in a sustainable political fix for where we find ourselves right now. Again, the idea that technology is going to be able to do this for you, I don't see how. I don't know how that could possibly happen. Yes, technology can be used to cover over a lot of things by doing things, like I said, it makes it possible for the government, for example, to alleviate poverty in many ways and prevent insurrection. But that's not a long-term sustainable model. How long can it go on? I don't know. I mean, there's no definite answer to this. This is not a mathematical problem that you can work out with a formula and figure, okay, this is what's going to happen at what point in time. Historically speaking, these things will go along. Some crisis will occur, which will precipitate them. And we do. In my point right now is that we have those crises in place that could precipitate a very quick. That's what you need to be ready for. That's what I'm saying. Um, and once those things, the old snowball rolls, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's my point, is that they don't seem, though they being the left, don't seem to understand the problems that could be unleashed with their, what I would call, irresponsible fomentation of insurrectionary activity. Put it that way. Once the horse is out of the barn, it's out of the barn. After that, that's it. Then, you're not getting it back. But getting back to Aristotle and Hobbes, Aristotle's view is that human beings are by nature political. I say that is essentially correct, that we are political by nature because we are social by nature. And that to some extent, the modern experiment, as based on Hobbesian theory of individual rights, was doomed to failure, although it's lasted for quite some time, several hundred years. Because that's contrary to human nature. It's not real, it's not true. And so you can cover over that, and that's what commercial republicanism has been able to do. Has been able to mask the fact that no, you're not an inherent little rights-bearing entity. You're a human being that's very needy. Commercial republicanism has been able to cover over that, thanks to, in large part, technological advancement made possible by scientific revolution, which occurred at the same time, 17th century. Those things helped make it possible to deflect the realities of nature, which Descartes, the Frenchman, which mentions in Discourse on Method. He says, it will allow us to become the masters and possessors of nature. He's talking about the scientific method that he helped to found. And that has been true, but it still has its limits. There are still, limits, anthropological limits based on human finitude. And this, as I said, does not seem to be grasped. And, there's no telling for sure when or where or how that band snaps. But current events seem to make it a lot more likely now than it would have been certainly 20 years ago, or even 40 years ago when Reagan was elected, or even at the conclusion of World War II, for that matter, when we were at the beginning of a new era in American and world history, where the first time you had a country that was technologically capable of literally dominating the world. That's still the case, but it's not based on a single country anymore. It's based on what I would call a kind of a technological ruling class, and all the desire to go back to the time when that wasn't the case. It's not going to happen. It's just like once the nuclear bombs were out, you weren't going back to a pre-nuclear age. Now in the post-digital era, we're not going back to the time when the nation state was the end-all be-all form of political organization and supreme. The technocrats are here to stay. The transnational corporations, individuals, all that kind of stuff. It's one of the laughable things I hear when they get these Trump supporters that start talking, he's a globalist. What do you think? You think we're going to go back to, and it would have to be the 19th century, we're going to go back to 1880? Even then, globalization was well underway. I mean, back when the nation state, as a form of government, still ruled and was relatively stable. We're not going back in time. The famous quote from Nietzsche, whispered in the ear of the conservative, only a crab goes backwards, and it's a human being can't. So, you're not going back to that. You're not doing away with globalization. I mean, that's a fantasy. The United States is never going to be an industrial power again. Our economy is not based on industrialization anymore. We wouldn't want to be. That doesn't generate near as much wealth as the post-industrial economy. generates. So no, we're not going back to being the manufacturing center of the world. There isn't going to be one. I mean that's over. That's what we were in 1945. Nobody is now. And China. No, China's not the manufacturing center of the world. They manufacture a lot of goods, but they're not the manufacturing center of the world. There isn't one. Otherwise, it's not a national. It's not a state-based thing anymore. And so, and until we come to grips with this and figure out a way of political organization that takes account of human biological necessities, by the way, not the fantasy that there aren't any such things as human biological necessities, then we're going to continue to have trouble. I mean, you'll have trouble even after that. There's no utopia coming down the road here. So, well, no. We'll just have to wait and see. But be careful. That's my point. Whoops. See you in the next video.